Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the ISAS seminar titled US-Pakistan Relations, How They Reflect and Affect Domestic Politics on Both Sides. My name is Divya Murli. I'm a research analyst at the Institute. The seminar will provide a historical perspective on the linkage between domestic politics and the US-Pakistan relations in both countries that has contributed to the chronic instability in their relationship. Today, we are delighted to have with us Professor Taqir Hussain, visiting senior research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore and former ambassador as well as senior diplomat of Pakistan, as the guest speaker. Associate Professor Iqbal Singh Sivia, Director of the ISAS, will chair the seminar. I shall now invite Associate Professor Sivia to deliver the opening remarks. Dr. Sivia, please.
Thank you, Divya. Good afternoon, Professor Hussain. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, I thank you for joining us in this afternoon's seminar titled US-Pakistan Relations, How They Reflect and Affect Domestic Politics on Both Sides. And I'm particularly delighted to see everybody in this room in this post-COVID scenarios. So thank you all for joining us. Imran Khan's innings as the Prime Minister of Pakistan came to an end when his government lost a no-confidence motion on April 9, 2022. In the last days of his government, Khan publicly suggested that a foreign power was part of a conspiracy to topple his government. Since then, Khan has portrayed himself as fighting for Hakiki Azadi, or true freedom, against foreign powers and their local conspirators, and described Pakistan's relations with the United States as humiliating. Khan's position on the relations between Pakistan and China and the United States are also said to have been an important reason undergirding the rifts between his government and the military. The military is said to be concerned not only by Khan's statements on the United States, but also his apparent over-reliance on China. Recent statements by the Chief of Army Staff, General Bajwa, on the significance of relations with the United States and the importance of military supplies seem to indicate that the military is keen on balancing Pakistan's relations with China and the United States. Thus, questions are rife about how the next government in Pakistan will navigate the US-Pakistan relationship. Of course, the US has witnessed its own debates about its position vis-a-vis Pakistan and how Pakistan fits in with the US's own evolving geopolitical visions. The US established diplomatic relations with Pakistan very shortly after Pakistan emerged as a nation state in 1947. Over the past 7 decades, the United States and Pakistan bilateral relationship has been multidimensional and complex. Thus, it is timely and important to review the US-Pakistan relationship. Today's seminar delves into the historical trajectory of the US-Pakistan relationship over the past 7 decades. Such a serious inquiry into the history of the bilateral relationship will no doubt help us to understand the simultaneous impact both states have on each other. I do not want to preempt anything that Prof. Hussain would be saying, but I would just highlight 3 broad points. And I seek your apology if I'm stating the obvious here with these 3 broad points. Firstly, the United States relations with Pakistan must be located within the context of South Asia's strategic significance to Washington. The region has become more relevant to the US for geopolitical, national security, and economic reasons. Please. Excellency. This has become more evident in recent years with the launch of the US Indo-Pacific Strategy, revitalization of the Quad, and the recent launch of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Secondly, Pakistan has been intertwined in the United States' position in Afghanistan. This has had far-reaching and interesting implications on Pakistan both internationally and domestically. On the one hand, this resulted in solidifying Pakistan's significance as a Cold War ally in the 1980s. On the other hand, during the Obama era, this resulted in the AFPAK strategy. As the nomenclature would suggest, Pakistan came to be viewed through the geopolitical lens of the problems in Afghanistan. The Taliban's re-emergence in Afghanistan in the wake of the withdrawal of the US and its coalition forces from the country have reopened this question. Lastly, over the years, it is believed that as Washington's influence in Islamabad waxed and waned, Islamabad fostered closer relations with Beijing on both economic and strategic fronts, especially with the launch of the China-Pacific Economic Corridor, or CPEC, in 2013. On the whole, the evolving security matrix in the region has raised the stakes for Pakistan as the country has to deal with the Taliban. Moreover, Pakistan has to find ways to cope with the deepening India-US relationship, given the growing importance of the Indo-Pacific region to American policymakers. Looking ahead, it is worth also considering how US-China tensions will constrain Pakistan's actions. How will Pakistan and the US relationship develop within these new challenges? Given Prof. Hussein's vast and rich experience as former senior diplomat of Pakistan and his extensive years of research and teaching at various institutions, he is the most suitable person to turn to for answers to such questions and many more. Like all of you, I look forward to hearing Professor Hussein's views, and I wish all of us an engaging session.
Thank you, Iqbal. Very kind of you and, for your introduction, and also raising the curtain on the subject of the talk. Of course, these are very important issues you have raised, and I will address them. But first, as the title of the talk suggests, I'm going to talk essentially about the linkage between domestic politics in both Pakistan and United States with US-Pakistan relations. That's going to be the subject. So the issue that Iqbal raised, I will address towards the end, but I have to stick to the title of the talk, which is essentially domestic politics. Before I begin, I want to recognize two good friends, Dr. Iftikhar Chaudhry, former Foreign Minister of Bangladesh, and who's no stranger to all of you, and my good friend, Her Excellency Rukhsana Afzal, Pakistan's High Commissioner. And I'm glad that you could join. As I said, this is not really a comprehensive review of the US-Pakistan relations, which I will sort of address towards the end and very briefly as to where we go in the light of issues that Iqbal has raised. But mainly I'm going to give you historical perspective on the linkage between domestic politics and US-Pakistan relations on both sides. Domestic politics and foreign policy are linked in every country, but the linkage is exceptionally strong in US and Pakistan, affecting their relationship in strange ways. This talk could not have been more timely, as Iqbal mentioned, as currently a major chunk of the Pakistan population is caught up in a frenzy about former Prime Minister Imran Khan's claim that the United States has conspired to have him removed from office. The strength of his supporters' belief in this claim is as much a reflection of their loyalty to him as their long-standing unhappiness with the United States for being an unreliable ally who has harmed Pakistan with its faulty policies and intervention in politics. Imran Khan's claims and his supporters' accusations are no doubt exaggerated, yet it's a fact that the United States has long been embedded in Pakistan's body politic, and the US-Pakistan relations have always been a factor in Pakistani politics and policies. Similarly, the relations have long been serving politics in Washington as well, where very often good politics makes bad policies and good policies make bad politics. And that affects the relationship in very mysterious ways. Let me begin with some general remarks about the relationship before I come to the historical perspective. For over last 6 decades, the US-Pakistan relationship have served some of the vital interests of the two countries, but it has not been a normal bilateral relations. Though from time to time, Pakistan enjoyed a high-profile aid relationship, it did not reflect a long-term US policy towards Pakistan. The central irony of the relationship is that the substantial aid levels do not reflect a substantive relationship. The US and Pakistan have engaged with each other 3 times, each time prompted by Washington's short-term need for Islamabad's cooperation to serve its critical security and strategic interests, and Pakistan's long-term need for the US economic support and strategic patronage. If the United States went ahead and had such extraordinary aid relationship with Pakistan from time to time, where it saw no lasting economic or strategic interests, obviously there was more than just a critical foreign policy issue at play. The specific task given to Pakistan was important not only strategically but also politically, especially so during the 1980s Afghanistan war and the post-9/11 Afghanistan war and the war on terrorism. Domestic politics always weighs heavily on wars, and it has been particularly true in America, where wars have always got many stakeholders and served many interests. Because of all that, Pakistan, which was an important partner in these wars, came to be handled by successive administrations in the United States through a relationship that was far out of proportion to the country's normal importance. Given the nature of the relationship, which focused largely on military intelligence cooperation and importance to the electoral politics in America. Afghanistan war, war on terrorism, the first one, very important for the electoral politics in America, both for the Congress and the President. The White House was driving the relationship, aided by the Pentagon and the CIA, and in Pakistan, military governments were in power. For Washington, the question was not what kind of relationship it should have with Pakistan, but what kind of role it wanted Pakistan to play. And most importantly, what it would take to make Pakistan do what the United States wanted it to do. That, and not the importance of Pakistan per se, determined the aid levels, which remained out of sync with the broad relationship and larger interests of the two countries. It was a US-driven and narrowly focused relationship. It was not a strategic relationship, but the irony is it was not truly transactional either. It was transactional, but dealing with strategic issues, some of which were contentious. The interests of the two countries did not always coincide. Even when their interests converged, their policies, perceptions, and politics often differed. Apart from these paradoxes, the relationship was marked by contradictions. Contradictions within their own relations and between these relations and their other relations. Both sides did not quite grasp these contradictions, but it did not matter much to Washington, where margin of error was very wide. The United States was just focused on a single issue. As long as American interests on that issue were served, it did not care about its own other interests or interests of Pakistan. It packed up and left, leaving behind many potential crises. As Kissinger has famously said, America has the knack of solving one crisis by creating another. There was no overarching policy towards Pakistan where Washington, as I said, saw no long-term interests. That is why the relationship was so sporadic and inconsistent, and that is why it could not gain sustained public support on both sides. Now, let's look at the relationship in historical perspective. In its early years, Pakistan faced serious challenges of external security and internal stability. To their credit, the army and civil bureaucracy helped the country survive against very heavy odds. And to the credit of the United States, that engaged with Pakistan from 1954 to 1965, it strengthened Pakistan's defense capabilities and potential for economic development that gave critical help in stabilizing the emergent state and helped build a good platform for progress. Pakistan had arrived. While in their first engagement, 1954 to 1965, the relationship was the most broad-based and most satisfying to both sides, yet this is the period that laid the foundations of misperceptions and grievances of later decades. Pakistan came to expect too much, and the United States came to demand too much. Pakistan thought the United States cannot walk away from Pakistan, and Washington felt Pakistan cannot do without it. These misperceptions have lingered on to the present day, kept alive by domestic politics, systemic issues, or lack of strategic consensus. During the first engagement in the Cold War rhetoric in Washington, inspired by domestic consideration as well as foreign policy needs, had overplayed the value of alliances and allies that sent a wrong message to America's allies. Washington oversold the relationship domestically, exaggerating Pakistan's importance as an ally. Washington had enlisted the largest Islamic country, which it hoped would influence the broader Islamic world. And Pakistan also served as a key link in the US chain of alliances from Europe to Asia. It made the symbolism of US-Pakistan alliance look good domestically and abroad, even though the substance of the relationship fell short. Pakistan, for its own domestic purposes, highlighted this inflated image as America's ally, basically to meet domestic reservations about the relationship. In Pakistan, sections of public opinion, political institutions, and strategic community thought the relationship was limiting Pakistan's other foreign policy choices, and that the US connection had strengthened the army, enhancing its political profile, thus hindering Pakistan's political process. This period also incited a misperception among public that Washington had preferred Pakistan to India. American policy of hyphenating the US relations with India and Pakistan did its own damage by fostering a feeling in Pakistan that if not preferentially, the United States should at least treat Pakistan and India equally, a feeling that continues till this day, even though it's no longer the same South Asia or the same India. Regional and international environment has changed so much. India loomed over the relationship in other ways as well. Though Pakistan accepted the aid as part of Washington's containment policy, Pakistan's real interest in joining the American alliance system lay somewhere else. It kept asking Washington for assurances that its alliance would work against India as well. It was thought this would address Pakistan's security dilemma, besides making the US-Pakistan relationship more popular in public, raising the regime's image. This Washington was not prepared to agree, both for foreign policy considerations and the domestic consideration. The US did not want to further alienate India, which was already unhappy that Washington had brought the Cold War to South Asia. And there was no support for this kind of deal with Pakistan in the US Congress, where the Democrats were more enthused by India than Pakistan. Yet Washington did not want to lose Pakistan as an ally, so it signed in 1959 a US-Pakistan Security Cooperation Treaty. Its vague assurances of support in case of an act of aggression against Pakistan solved political problems of both sides. Washington could claim it was not a treaty against Pakistan, and Pakistan could claim that it was. But this set up a dilemma in the relationship that came to haunt their future engagements. In the interest of not losing each other, both sides continued to make commitments which they either did not mean or which could not keep. When the reality was exposed, there were cries of betrayal on both sides, though truly speaking, neither side betrayed, or at least not as much as it was accused of. No wonder all Pakistani-US engagements started off well but ended up badly. This is how their first engagement in 1954 to 1965 ended. With the US-Soviet détente, South Asia became an area of low strategic priority. Secondly, the Democrats had come to power. They had a fresh look at the John Foster Dulles alliance system. They retained only indispensable American allies and relegated Pakistan's status, especially after the 1965 Sino-India War, leaving behind a trail of puzzlement and unhappiness in Pakistan. Pakistan had earlier mistakenly seen an equivalence between the quantum of aid and the quality of relationship. Public and government alike recalled American leadership's highly effusive statements about Pakistan and wondered what had hit them. Little did Pakistan realize that American political leadership is given to hyperbolic rhetoric and that these were political statements, not policy statements. Such compliments built up the stock of their allies within America, besides acting as a flattery to the partner regimes and an exercise in public relations for them in their home countries. Pakistan did not realize that the United States did not have a Pakistan policy, or for that matter, South Asia policy. And when the United States walked away from Pakistan in 1965, it walked away from South Asia also. The unhappiness got worse in 1971 war with India, where Pakistan, like in the 1965 war before that, thought the United States should have come to Pakistan's help, but did not. A close scrutiny of the US treaty obligations to Pakistan, however, leave no doubt that historical US commitments were essentially in the context of communist threat to Pakistan security. The US therefore did not really break any treaty commitments to Pakistan. But somehow Pakistan, public at least, did not understand that. That is when we first felt stirrings of anti-American sentiments in Pakistan among the public. Public could not square up the reality that when the past rhetoric like Nixon's praise of Pakistan as the most allied ally of the United States and Pakistan-US relationship being a cornerstone of American policy in Asia. Though the official Pakistan shared public disappointment that the United States had let Pakistan down, it remained favorably disposed as it needed the United States. The United States had moved on, but Pakistan remained stuck in the alliance mentality. The reason had a lot to do with landmark changes that had been taking place within Pakistan. With the end of Ayub era, especially the best period of its economic achievement, that also coincided with the tapering of the US-Pakistan relations, Pakistan's traditions transition to democracy. Though, to the credit of Pakistani people, and the quality of democracy over the decades has improved vastly, but still faces many challenges, especially how to emerge out of the shadow of the army, which not only got professionally stronger, but also politically because of the long periods of military rule, and how to break loose from the control of socially dominant and other elitist groups and the influence of the Islamic groups. The system has posed challenges of governance and political stability, affecting Pakistan's national development, especially economy, and limiting its vast potential. It made Pakistan dependent on external powers. That has been the story since 1971. Pakistan's dependence on US was fostered in part to have a political and diplomatic support of the United States, even though the relationship was not close. And there was need to fall back on help from a big power to occasionally help the country, especially with organizations like World Bank, IMF. The United States was also important as a trading partner, and it could help manage India-Pakistan crisis. Pakistan continued to have foreign policy successes, the crowning achievement being the ever-growing relations with China. it had also successfully developed a nuclear deterrent besides enhancing the conventional war capability. But other foreign affairs successes, notably engagement with the US and relations with Saudi Arabia, who both used Pakistan for their own strategic purposes, came at a cost to Pakistan. The two engagements between the United States and Pakistan, especially during the 80s Afghanistan war and after 9/11, were particularly costly. First of these engagements with the United States began in December 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Since then, the US-Pakistan relations has essentially been a war-related relationship involving two wars, the Afghanistan war of 80s and post-9 and the war on terrorism. But these wars had either terribly flawed strategies or were unnecessary and avoidable. And in Afghanistan especially, the United States did not have good partners, and it kept changing its strategy all the time. They represented the worst of the systemic problems in Washington. Conflict-related relations are often troubled, especially if the wars are not going well. They had a terrible fallout for Pakistan. These engagements were a mixed bargain for the country, but benefited the regimes that happened to be military. The fact is, it's not Pakistan, but its services have been important to Washington. And it's the army that provided the service. It gained from the relationship, as did the regime, but the benefit to the country and the people was limited. These were regimes which were keen for international legitimacy and financial support. The stimulus for the US-Pakistan relationship in Pakistan was largely domestic politics, though one must concede some of Pakistan's security interests were also served. So to the credit of US-Pakistan relationship, one must say over the years it has helped Pakistan. Particularly the 80s engagement gave Pakistan the cover to complete its nuclear program. Credit for this goes to both the civilian and military leadership, who have been equally determined to defend the program as they have defended some other core interests of Pakistan, especially strategic relationship with China. US connection has over the decades strengthened the army, enhancing its political profile, and it has jealously guarded this special connection. Secondly, the army feels that since it is the reason for the relationship and the aid that comes with it, it should have influence over it. It does not want the United States to engage the civilians seriously or directly and wants to be kind of intermediary with them. Politicians who saw Pakistan receiving substantial aid during a military government came to believe that if they somehow assured Washington of their own commitment to the relations, they too would be the recipients of US largesse, and they went extra lengths to curry favor with Washington in the mistaken belief that since the US liked the army so much, it may have brought it to power, and perhaps they too could get Washington's help. But the civilians did not realize that the factors that had historically affected Pakistan's interest in Pakistan have been primarily military and intelligence related. So given the nature of the relationship, the military, for obvious reason, has been the main player in the relationship, almost from the beginning. And it so happens that the military was already there when the United States' need for it arose. Pakistan's political system works fairly autonomously. Its relationship with Washington is not a factor of US control over it. Pakistan does have control over its own system. And none of these governments were brought to power by the United States. In fact, sometimes the United States played an extra role to give a civilian face to the military, like they did when they put pressure on Musharraf to share the governance with Benazir. and they brokered an agreement with her. But even when the civilians were in power, Washington still preferred to deal with the army. But this bargain now has been rejected by the people of Pakistan, as the spillover of the Afghanistan war did create horrendous problems for the country, exacerbating the simmering anti-Americanism over Washington having been an unreliable ally, alternating between engagement and estrangement and reward and punishment, and that it had forced Pakistan to fight its wars which threatened to destabilize Pakistan. India's growing relationship with the United States, especially the nuclear agreement and Washington's refusal to give the same deal to Pakistan, fostered perceptions among public and army alike that the United States and India were opposed to Pakistan's nuclear program. So sections of the army too started harboring anti-Americanism. Thus, the relationship that embraced the closest military cooperation in the history of the relationship came to rest on the weakest of domestic support, beginning with later years of Bush administration and lasting all through Obama administration, whose drone attacks infuriated people. Governments, including the authoritarian one like that of Musharraf, had to remain conscious of the need not to go entirely against public sentiments. It tried to maintain a careful balance between the need to meet US demands and accommodate public pressures. But Washington kept upsetting that balance by demanding that Pakistan do more. As the government got squeezed between America's demand to do more and public pressure to do less, the government ended up supporting the US with only half-hearted and weak policies that neither satisfied Washington nor Pakistani public. So for the first time, even during an ongoing engagement, the United States-Pakistan relationship became adversarial on both sides. The challenge was no longer how to make a transactional relationship become strategic, but how to make even a transactional relationship work. It brought out the worst in both countries' systems. The capitalist system of America looks at most relations transactionally. It believes money can buy friendships. The question is always, are we getting the bang for our buck? And the Americans, for the Americans, the relationship is not only transactional, but also contractual. They always keep reminding others that a deal is a deal. If we have given money, we should get some return. So this set up recurring tensions between the two countries. Americans focused on how much money they had given to Pakistan, and Pakistan talked of how much they had suffered because of America. Both saw the relationship through the prism of their own pain. I'm not sure if this is the best way to run complex foreign policy issues, but this is how Washington works. Washington's foreign policy process is one of a kind and often quite bizarre. Historically, because Pakistan's importance was not so self-evident, it was always difficult for a friendly US administration to organize a working coalition in support of Pakistan. The fact is, Pakistan did not have a sustained constituency in Washington. Pakistan's problem was that in the Congress as well as in the media, its enemies were permanent, but friends were temporary. There was a constant tussle between the supporters and detractors of Pakistan in Washington. They lived with or tolerated differences with Pakistan when they were overriding strategic interests, but when these interests had been served, the attention shifted to the negatives that had remained submerged under strategic interests during the time of the close cooperation. Pakistan then came under strict scrutiny by media and Congress. The administration did not have political capital in Washington to fight for Pakistan when its services were no longer needed. So as soon as America's vital interests were served, it became awfully hard for any administration to continue fighting for Pakistan, even if it wanted to, which it did not anyway. So instead of defending Pakistan, it tried to placate the opponents of the relationship by slapping sanctions or tarnishing Pakistan's image. If you take away the peak relationships from 1954 to 1965, from 1979 to 1989, and 2001 to 2010, what do you have in the remaining 35 years of the 65 years of the relationship? Of these 35 years, Pakistan was under sanctions for 25 years. Much of the damage to the relationship was done, as I've said, in the past 10, 12 years by the very institution that used to be the friendliest to Pakistan, Pentagon and to some extent CIA, joined by the White House and Congress. It was incited by the failure of the Afghanistan war and Bin Laden issue. Previously, the relationship used to be a single issue based. Now there were multiple issues and multiple stakeholders, and it was difficult for Washington to have a coherent and harmonious US strategy. They all looked for scapegoats for the failure of the Afghanistan war. So Pakistan came in for a fair amount of negative attention from multiple directions. American trust in Pakistan worsened due to unfounded public suspicion of the Pakistan authorities being complicit in sheltering Bin Laden. The United States' extraordinary relationship with India and its emerging China containment policy also began casting a shadow on the US-Pakistan relationship. The fact is, issues relating to Pakistan have changed so much in Washington. The conventional wisdom, for instance, that Republicans are friendly and Democrats are unfriendly, no longer holds true. The issues relating to Pakistan now put both Republicans and Democrats on the same side. There were political dilemmas in Pakistan side also. Over the years, public has become more anti-American, while the leadership has remained a believer in long and fixed relationship with the US. Now, the gap between public perceptions and leaders has narrowed, especially after the blowback of the partnership with the US in the war on terrorism and Afghanistan war. Though Pakistani policies have remained pro-US because of Pakistan's increasing need for the United States and relationship with big powers, the media and public rhetoric in Pakistan has become anti-American, shared quietly by a cross-section of the ruling establishment. Gone are the days that the United States could relate to Pakistan and many of its other partners as a pliant ally run by a client regime. Because of global changes, an increasingly self-conscious and politically aware population in these countries has now become very vocal about their political rights and about what is good for them in their foreign relations. So both the domestic and international orders are under challenge. In Pakistan, especially, the relationship with America are under scrutiny and questioning. It has become a reflection of a wide spectrum of public unhappiness. It's not about America alone. Relations with America have become a factor in the power struggle in Pakistan also, especially in recent years. But as I said, governments have used the American connection to get United States financial and diplomatic support, and the opposition has used anti-Americanism to delegitimize the government, like the lawyers' movement against Musharraf, and later on Imran Khan's campaign against sitting governments. And it's not just, as I said, about America alone. At some level, it is not even about America. Actually, Imran Khan's rhetoric was one of the reasons Army's relationship with Imran Khan soured, as it complicated Army's desire to have good relations with the United States. Since his ouster, he has doubled down on anti-Americanism. The strategy is to malign the political opponents and the system on one hand and the United States on the other in the worst possible terms by taking advantage of existing public unhappiness with both, and then connect his opponents and the United States in a relationship that he describes in the worst possible way, slavery, the Urdu word ghulami, and Iqbal mentioned about his attempt to sort of talk of freedom from this. So he has exploited strong human emotions of morality, religion, and nationalism, and this seems to be working. Whether Imran Khan returns to power or not, the phenomena he has unleashed will live on, and for good or bad, will have an effect on Pakistan's national policies, including the relations with the United States. This has been a long talk about domestic politics and the US-Pakistan relations, but as you well understand, this is but just one element of the relationship. So before I close, I just want to say a few words about the future of the relationship, about which Iqbal had mentioned, that still remains important for the two countries. As we look ahead, divergent influences will shape and impact the trajectory of the bilateral relationship. Let me list them one by one. Number one, it will be affected unfavorably by the US-India ties, positively by the Pakistan's potential role in Afghanistan, unpredictably by US-China tension, and unexpectedly by domestic political compulsions in America and Pakistan. The fact is, as you may have seen from my presentation, it's a need-based relationship. And as in previous highs and lows they have demonstrated, you never know when this need might arise again. If the past is any indication, the need will arise. Regardless of its disillusionment with the US, Pakistan military has always been keen to have good relations with Washington. The reluctance always came from the United States, not from Pakistan. Good news is, unlike in the past, when the United States disengagement was accompanied by estrangement and sanctions, this time the door is open to normal relations. Clearly, the relations with the United States were affected not only in the spat with Imran Khan, but also in the so-called Bajwa doctrine prompted by reconsideration of Pakistan's priorities. It began with February 2020 ceasefire agreement with India along the line of control in Kashmir and revelations of back-channel conversations with India. On 18th March 2021, in Pakistan's first ever public security dialogue, General Bajwa stated that it's our desire to change the narrative of geopolitical contestation into geo-economic integration. He also extended an olive branch to India. He and the government have been saying that Pakistan needs good relations with all big powers. Perhaps the feeling is that if India can have close ties with Washington and seek normalization with China, Pakistan too should have close relations with Beijing and seek working relationship with the United States. Pakistan knows that the days of a high-profile aid relationship are over. It now desires investment, trade, and assistance with international financial institutions, particularly the International Monetary Fund. Washington too has indicated an interest in having a working relationship with Pakistan. Pakistan is geopolitically significant to the US. Besides, Pakistan has important economic interests, has some economic interest in Pakistan. It might also like to see if offering Pakistan an American alternative could contain Pakistan-China relations. One good that might come out of the crisis created by Imran Khan is that the United States might start dealing with the civilians, as continuing to deal behind their back with the army might give rise to conspiracy theories. The US should also realize that a relationship in which leadership benefits but people don't, will not work. Pakistan may not be an ally, but it should not be alienated. As for Pakistan, it should realize that it needs to lower its expectations of the relationship and reduce dependence on external players, be it America or any other power. The bottom line is the relationship needs to be brought to a level of cooperation that is sustainable and avoids codependency. It's not a vital relationship, but does not mean it's not necessary. Let me close by saying Pakistan has enormous strengths, remarkable resilience, faith-based optimism, a sense of exceptionalism, a vibrant media, a promising civil society, and IT professionals, and functioning institutions, including a capable military and good diplomatic service. Overall, a Pakistan that is economically and politically stable will be better instrumental to the United States in realizing its goals in the region. Can Pakistan become such a country? I remain hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hussain, for that comprehensive talk, in which you have highlighted key aspects of the historical backdrop to the relationship, the reconfigurations of the relationship between the two, and you've also pointed out to certain potential trajectories of bilateral relations between the US and Pakistan. And I'm sure there'll be a number of questions. I'm delighted to say we have about half an hour or so for questions and discussions. But maybe I can just insert my own question first before I open it to the floor. And it's going to be a broad. I have a number of questions, but one broad question before I open the floor. Your talk is subtitle of your talk is how they reflect and affect domestic politics on both sides. If I was to flip that the other way around to see how domestic politics affects foreign relations, and the truism that everybody says is that in America and Pakistan, foreign policy foreign policy is not a domestic issue traditionally. However, given that it's become part of the political rhetoric now, my question is two-pronged in terms. Firstly, will the developments in Pakistan now have an impact on foreign relations or rather the accusations that Imran Khan is making have an impact in the elections and subsequently? But also, how do we square the fact that historically, be it Democrat or Republican, they've had the same policy towards Pakistan, most of the time, not always, but in Pakistan as well, be it Ayub, Benazir, or be it Nawaz, there's not been a reconfiguration of their approach towards the US as well. So do we see these two things changing in the next elections?
As far as Imran Khan's position is concerned, as I suggested in the talk also, that he was exploiting the sentiment against America for two reasons. One, to sort of highlight the sense of nationalism in Pakistan, because he has been speaking about it, that you need to be on your own, you need to be nationalistic, you need to be proud, and you need to be self-sufficient. So that was a kind of a indirect. And the second, he was also sending a message to the Americans that, look, gone are the days then you could just find us very compliant. You will be dealing with a Pakistan now that is more assertive and more conscious of its interests and more conscious of whom it chooses as friends. So that was a message. And third, a message to the army as well, that you cannot just use that connection with America to enhance your own influence in Pakistan. So all these are partly political, partly policy. If there's a right mix, and let's say if he comes to power, he might manage to come up with a policy which addresses the political part as well as the policy part, and we may still be able to see normal relations with the United States. I think United States understands. United States is aware, because this sentiment against the United States didn't start with Imran Khan. It has been going on for a long time. And they have been hearing about it for long, and they, both sides know each other's complaints against them. I mean, it's nothing new. Imran Khan sort of maybe raised the decibel level and sort of used it for more focused changes. So I don't think it's going to do give any irreparable damage to the relationship. Relationship can be, because both sides need it. Yeah. The second question, it covers both. Yeah.
So the floor is open to questions. There'll be a mic. There'll be roving, I believe. Yeah. So if there's any questions, please raise your hand and I just identify yourself. Oh, sorry, Excellency. Oh. Yanish.
Sir, you, in the beginning, early part of your presentation, you used the word quality of aid and quality of relationship. So this is one question. I have two questions, so this is the first one. So quality of relationship, what are the indices? How does one measure quality of relationship? Is it really personalities, interests, contexts, which shape the quality of relationship? And if I may also add another question. I found it intriguing that you, in mentioning the different phases of relations between the US and Pakistan and the high points in that relationship, I was hoping to hear something about the Nixon years, especially the role Pakistan played in bringing China and US together. And that, the whole relationship between China and the US, particularly, especially in the recent context about road and belt. I was hoping you would say something more about this.
I can say that now, because there were so many things to cover when you were talking about 65 years of relationship. The quality of relationship, when I said that, it means whether the two countries have a shared vision, whether they have a sense of continuity, whether they have sort of a long-term need, which gives them a kind of which helps them to think strategically in planning as to the nature as well as the duration of the relationship, so that it doesn't become kind of a one-off thing. The two countries look at the relationship and feel that, look, here are our interests which seem to be long-term, and we have some shared concerns, and if we cooperate and with a sense of predictability and sense of continuity where each side trusts the others that it will remain involved, then we will better able to. That quality was missing in the relationship. The reason being that, as I mentioned, Pakistan did want a long-term relationship. Pakistan did want a long-term economic support, did want a long-term strategic support. But the United States' concern right from day one had been short-term, expedient, and transactional. So it was prepared to compensate Pakistan very well. In fact, Pakistan was compensated far out of proportion to its real value. That's why when the relationship ended, it was punished far out of proportion to the crime of Pakistan. So in both ways, the policy was wrong. I mean, the American policy usually tends to move in extremes. I mean, somehow they cannot find a balance. They can't. Subtlety is not really a strong point of America. They move in extremes, hot and cold and all that. So they either rewarded Pakistan exceptionally or punished Pakistan so unfairly. Now, Pakistan accepted the rewards maybe sometime gratefully, sometime ungratefully, but when the punishment came, they could not take it because they could not understand. They could not square up with the statements by Nixon, for example, Pakistan being most allied ally of United States, or Pakistan-US relationship being a cornerstone of American policy in Asia, and other statements. Pakistan was called as frontline state. Reagan praised him, George Shultz praised him, even George Bush praised him that we can do business with Musharraf and all that. So all these praises were somehow at odds with the quality of, the United States essentially did not worry about quality of it, they just worried about what services they are going to get from Pakistan, and they compensated them monetarily as well as with compliments. So compliments plus money, that was what they did. As far as your question about China, the US-China contacts were going on behind the scenes before they contacted Pakistan. In fact, at an ambassador level, dialogue was going on quietly for a long time, but it was not getting anywhere. And then they contacted some other countries, Romania, for example, if I remember, to play some role. Nothing worked. So they needed a country which enjoyed the trust of both sides and also needed both sides so much that would maintain confidentiality of the contact. And they found that in Pakistan. And Pakistan played that role very well in sort of bringing the two countries together, okay? Now, as you may have guessed from my talk, there are policies and there is politics. Often, because of politics, leadership ends up highlighting a certain action or achievement or an event so exceptionally that people start taking it as a policy. For example, the Chinese have been sort of ceaselessly mentioning from time to time to the Americans, don't forget Pakistan, the bridge that connected us to. The fact is, I mean, I'm being very candid with you on that. Pakistan helped to bring these two countries together. But what happened when they went together, there was a very serious dialogue between Kissinger and Zhou Enlai, and it is that dialogue which brought rapprochement. Pakistan did not bring about the rapprochement, but the kind of rhetoric that surrounds this whole affair has made Pakistanis feel as if their role was so critical in bringing the rapprochement between the two. If you ask me, their role in rapprochement was not there. Their role was essentially in bringing about a dialogue which led to rapprochement. It's quite possible that dialogue may not have led to that rapprochement. It's quite possible. But it did, because the two countries, for their own reasons, wanted a good relationship. So while it's an important sort of event historically, but I think its significance has been a little bit exaggerated by both Pakistan and China.
Thank you, Talqir, for an excellent presentation. And I should also like to thank you for recognizing my presence, which I see as a...
I have to recognize the presence of Ambassador Menon also,
Ambassador
and
Menon
distinguished former Foreign Secretary,
so all of us
and former High Commissioner to Pakistan.
And we see this as a gesture of friendship, which we appreciate, of course. To the last point that you were speaking to just moments ago, yes, it's true that Pakistan played the role of what would be a facilitator. You're quite right to say that what would have happened, something else could have happened, and it would not have ended in the kind of rapprochement that we spoke of. It's also true that there were efforts made through Romania, as you said, but the problem with Romania was Romania didn't have the kind of relations with the United States that Pakistan did. So it was easy for Pakistan to play that facilitator's role, which it did, and which led to a good result, a positive result. Now, the question is that a possibility which is there in the future as well? Because you spoke at one point of America's efforts to contain Pakistan-China relations. Would that redound to America's interest, or is there a possibility that America could use Pakistan again as a conduit to China at a point in time as we see burgeoning differences, emerging, deepening of cleavage between China and the United States, and China will be the sort of ultimately the main antagonist of the United States. At that point in time, America would need a facilitator. Now, Imran Khan's ability to sort of muster public spirit, etc., could help America at that point in time if Pakistan is able to repeat what it did in 1971 in bringing US and China together.
Thank you, Iftikhar. We are talking here of two very different relationships, US-China of before 1971 and the US-China relation now. I mean, they're not recognizable, the two relationships. The problems between the two at that time were not essentially kind of an estrangement. And it's easy to end an estrangement than to deal with an adversarial or sort of competitive relationship, number one. The amount of economic sort of context that you have between US and China, and the academics, and the think tanks, and the diplomats. So if, let's say, United States at some point decides to seek normalization, there's no dearth of contacts. I mean, you will have very high-profile corporate heads who will be very happy to go and play their role because it's in their own interest also. And some of them have already established good relations with the Chinese leadership. So if the United States does decide to seek, they're not going to look towards Pakistan. Because as I said, because of the fact that they do have direct now links, and they meet also, they have that dialogue too. At that time in 1971, they didn't even meet face to face. Now they meet. They often end up abusing each other, but they still meet. So that is not a problem. They can still meet and have a kind of a fiery exchange and still have behind the scenes. So I frankly don't see that possibility, Imran Khan being asked to play that role. And secondly, I think, let's say, United States, China had no contacts and they wanted the quality of relationship that Pakistan has with China is not the same with the United States. So at that time it was same, so they could sort of be trusted by both. Now for the United States to trust Pakistan with Pakistan, such close relationship with China is very difficult.
While the audience mulls away, maybe I'll chip in with another
Please
question. For much, I'm thinking about the historical trajectory. For much of the past 2 to 3 decades, Pakistan has either been seen by the US as a solution to problems in Afghanistan or part of the problem in Afghanistan. Yeah. Now, with recent developments of the US disengaging from Afghanistan, do we see a dehyphenation of Afghanistan and Pakistan in the future from US perspective?
You know, Iqbal, Afghanistan remains a problem, very serious problem. It's sort of, its potential to give space to transnational terrorist groups remains, okay? It is also giving space to elements which are hostile to Pakistan. And they threaten Pakistan's stability as well. So what happened in Afghanistan is, in my view, as much of a concern to the United States as what happened in Afghanistan before. So Afghanistan has not disappeared as a source of concern to the United States. The issue is, previously, the United States tried to solve that problem with direct intervention, and it failed. But now it can only solve its problem indirectly. Who's going to solve it? That's the problem. Who's going to? So they have to rely on Pakistan. That's a very important sort of source they have to depend on. And Pakistan too would depend on them, because this question of dealing with Afghanistan is not just up to Pakistan. You have question of Afghanistan's economic stabilization. You have a question of the rights of women and education in Pakistan. You have a question of Afghanistan being friendly to other countries in the region, India, Pakistan, China, and all that. So that is not up to Pakistan alone. It's not the Taliban of 1990s, where the Taliban took over a dysfunctional country and continued to run it dysfunctionally. They took over this time a half-functional country, and brought it to a dysfunctional, almost. So it's a very, the United States, economic support is needed, international community's economic support is needed, because if Afghanistan's economy melts down and there is a refugee influx, Pakistan is going to face a very serious crisis, already with its own economic problems. So Pakistan needs to make the international community, Europeans, Americans alike, aware of the cost of neglecting Afghanistan. So that is one. Secondly, if the issue of, let's say, terrorist threat coming from Afghanistan is persistent and not too difficult for Pakistan to handle, for example, Pakistan did take action militarily itself in April, but it becomes too difficult, then it may be some degree of support or cooperation between Pakistan and the United States, like they used to do before also, become necessary. So my own view is the United States needs Pakistan, Pakistan needs the United States for the stabilization of Afghanistan, which is of interest to both countries. Maybe United States faces a security threat, Pakistan faces a broader socio-economic threat, and plus the terrorists who are based in Afghanistan and giving Pakistan a problem.
Mr. Mayor.
Two small questions. Need a mic? Thanks. Sorry, thank you, Toki. I'm sorry I missed the beginning, because what was obviously a fascinating talk, at least the bits I heard. Two small questions, maybe you've answered them already. One is Iran a factor in Pakistan-US relations? And the other is, did I understand you correct to say that you think it is possible for Pakistan to have a special relationship with China while maintaining normal relations with the US, despite China-US relations?
Okay, good questions. And my own view is, I will give you a short answer to your first question. Iran is not a very big factor, in the US-Pakistan relation. Iran becomes a factor, I've noticed, when US-Pakistan relationship becomes very close, and the Iranians starts sort of having all kinds of suspicions what's going on, you see. So that but when the US-Pakistan relationship cools off, Iranians are not so afraid. Then Afghanistan was also a factor in Iran's approach towards Pakistan, but Americans have left, so that factor is gone. About the other question, that is, sorry, say that again. Okay. That's a very important question. First, United States has to decide what kind of relationship it wants with Pakistan. To be very honest, I'm not sure they have decided it yet. This is my view, because of the different preoccupations. You have preoccupation with the midterm elections, you have domestic problems in America, plus Ukraine and all that. And they have not really decided on Pakistan. Assuming that they have time to now, when the time comes that they have found a strategy, what to do? They will have two options. To punish Pakistan for being close to China, that's not going to work. It will push Pakistan more into the arms of China. So second is to have some engagement to see if it can give Pakistan an option to reduce its over-dependence on China. And if that option is given, and if that over-dependence is reduced, naturally it might redefine Pakistan-China relations as well. And the second thing is, I'm reminded of a very good policy that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto had started, bilateralism. Although it's very difficult to implement in today's world, but it made a lot of sense, theoretical sense, that and India with its own strategic autonomy will understand it better than what I can explain. That Pakistan-China relationship is very important, but as long as Pakistan does not get involved in playing China's game in the overall US-Pakistan geopolitics, United States might be able to live with that. The crisis will occur when Pakistan, on one hand, is having a relationship with United States, at the same time undermining United States to the extent where the US-China competition is decided in favor of China. So Pakistan has to be very careful. My own feeling is Pakistan is careful. Pakistan knows, let me put it this way, Pakistan knows the red lines. This is my view. Please.
I had a very quick question. You talked about the different phases of the relationship between Pakistan and the US. Would you say that during the three periods that you had of military rule, Ayub Khan, Zia-ul Haq, and Pervez Musharraf, during these phases you saw America, the relationship between Pakistan and America being closer for various reasons, as in contrast to when Pakistan had civilian rule?
If you keep the mic close to you, I didn't hear you properly.
Oh, so the question was, during the three periods of military rule in Pakistan under Ayub, Zia-ul Haq, and Pervez Musharraf, do you see the relationship between the US and Pakistan being closer during those periods as compared to the periods of civilian rule for various?
No, I addressed that in my talk. The reason it was closer was that Pakistan was important for the United States basically for military cooperation, for intelligence cooperation, and for that the military was very relevant, and the military's role was very critical for the cooperation. And it so happened that when the United States needed Pakistan for that purposes, military was already in power. Zia-ul Haq came to power in 1977 by staging a coup. And the first 2 years, relationship was very bad. Actually, Pakistan came under sanctions. It came under sanctions in April 1978. The project aid was cut off because of the nuclear program, and in April 1979, all economic security assistance was cut off. So it's not that the United States had per se preference for military. No, our United States may have been happy that military came to power. Come December 1979, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the whole equation changes. So United States decides to get involved in Afghanistan, what I call is the last battle of the Cold War. I mean, it had nothing to do with South Asia. They just came and wanted to play that battle, defeat Soviet Union ultimately. And Pakistan's role was absolutely crucial. And the civilians, of course, could not play that role. The military did, and the military was already in power. And the objective having been achieved by towards the late 80s, and the Americans started sort of pulling out from the region, but they didn't mind if Ziaul-Haq continued. Ziaul-Haq continued for a little more longer, even though his need was gone. So it's not that the United States brought these regimes to power and in order to get, they were already there. Musharraf, 1999, in October 1999, he comes, and he too was isolated like Ziaul-Haq was till October 2001. So he too was sanctioned, and sort of, there were democracy-related sanctions. Pakistan was already under sanction, Preston Amendment and Glenn Amendment and all that, because of the nuclear explosion, plus the early around 1990 Preston Amendment. So again, same repetition of Ziaul-Haq's. Musharraf became a darling of the West, and the United States started giving aid. And then they later on felt that they had no use for him, because Pakistan was, as I mentioned to you, was feeling that this bargain was not good. Pakistan was suffering because of the Afghanistan war. And there, it didn't really matter whether civilians were ruling or military were ruling. Relationship became very troubled, very troubled.
Thank you, Professor, for the very enlightening talk. I have a small question. Since we were comparing the relations between, say, in Pakistan and US, and the China and Pakistan relations now. My question to you is, I mean, you mentioned the relationship between US and Pakistan was more or less connected with wars, defense, intelligence, and aid. So, but whereas with the relationship with China, it's more towards economic relationships. So in terms of public perceptions, what is, how the public feels in terms of getting benefits of these relationships for inclusive development in Pakistan? How do they look at this? Whether the benefits are really trickling down to the common man or the public in the country?
There are a number of things. Firstly, the relationship is not really comparable. Chinese are now a wide range of economic and strategic relationship with Pakistan, and they have been there since 1965, 66, and done many things for Pakistan, which public can see and public can benefit from also. So they look around and say that, look, here is something which the Chinese have done, and we have benefited from it. Whereas they look around and say, the United States, it comes, uses us, and then disappears and sanctions us. So they don't understand why. So there is even though the United States too has done a lot of good things for Pakistan, especially in the first engagement. They had, they enhanced Pakistan's defense capability. They gave very critical economic help to Pakistan. They set up good educational institutions, rural development program, many other good things that they did. But when you public later on saw Pakistan being mistreated, so it has an emotional impact, so people tend to forget. And then that was a long time ago. I mean, young people or even their parents have not seen those good things that the United States did at that time. So the relationship has become the United States more known as an unreliable ally. To some degree, perhaps unfairly, but this is how public perceptions are. Compared with that, China is seen as a steadfast friend. And thirdly, I think the Chinese are very clever. I mean, they see the contrast between Pakistan's perception of China and Pakistan's perception of the United States, and they too have benefited from that contrast, because China looks good anyway, but when compared with the United States, it looks even better. So so they have benefited from anti-Americanism because they feel that we can. And of course, they have a problem, the advantage of the system. They don't have sort of media and think tank community every day hectoring them to do this and do that. And you know, I keep telling my American friends, I says, your foreign policy is valid only from morning TV news to evening TV news. You know, then you redesign it the next day. The Chinese don't have that worry. I mean, the authoritarian regime's foreign policy is more flexible than the democratic regime. Democrats get prisoners of the public opinion, and all the time poll numbers. Where are we? What is the 52%? This 42%. I teach and I tell my students. I said, if I hear anything about polls, I'm going to give you 0. Don't talk me about the polls, and don't talk to me about the Twitter either, because that is also not really policy. That's a kind of an emotional response. So the Chinese benefit. So they have created a very romanticized view among Pakistanis of their relationship. But you never know, as Ambassador Menon asked in his very pertinent question, if America does decide to engage Pakistan and the two countries have start competing, then where does public stand? So that day, I don't know whether it will come or not, but that day when that comes, we will see how it goes.
We have another question from Karthik.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor. So I have a question about the IMF, and just wondering, how does the role of the IMF play out in domestic politics in Pakistan? Are people able to distinguish with what the IMF is hoping the Pakistani government institutes in terms of reforms, with what the US role in the IMF is? Are they able to make that distinction clearly in Pakistan?
I'm not an economist. I can't tell you the answer of an economist, but IMF too has a problem, I tell you, because IMF, the way it relates to countries sometimes on for political reasons, it has sort of a credibility problem also. So even when it tells countries to do good things, people don't want to do it. This is number one. Secondly, there's a very prominent economist, Joseph Stiglitz, he's a Nobel Prize winner. He wrote about this IMF. The IMF's sort of solutions create a lot of problems for the populations of these countries. And everything that IMF tells people to do is not always good. So I think IMF needs to reinvent itself. It's a very important institution, but it lacks kind of continuity. And why I say that, because I have seen countries have also now learned the way to beat IMF at their own game. I mean, when IMF asking for things, they sometimes agree because of the IMF. So once the IMF disappears from the scene, then they go back and stop doing this. So I think, so both ways, it's a kind of IMF needs to make sure that it's taken more seriously. And my own view is it will be taken more seriously when IMF takes decisions not on political grounds, because it too gets influenced by big powers, especially the United States, and sometimes treats other countries unfairly. So people have lost kind of credibility. People don't have that much credibility in IMF. But it's a very important and critical institution. Pakistanis need it, and if you ask me my personal opinion, I think Pakistan should do what the IMF are asking her to do, because Pakistan's problems are now such that they do need long-term solutions. The problem is the governments that have come, they're not going to be around for long term. So they don't want to impose pain on people and be nowhere there when the benefits come, because someone else will benefit and they will not be there. So these are the issues there.
If there's no other questions, I'll throw in one very brief question to end the session. Does Pakistan view its diaspora in the US as a potential asset in developing its trade links and bilateral relations with the US? And I'm thinking here about India's attempts to galvanize the diaspora in the US.
You know, diaspora of Pakistan, I don't know about Indian diaspora, but Pakistani diaspora, over the years, since they don't live in Pakistan, they have sort of an idealistic vision what Pakistan should be, but they don't know the reality and what Pakistan can do and should do. So they sometimes get carried away by just false hopes that someone gives them. And when they actually, some of them have tried to invest, and when they see that the sort of, they're not treated as well as they may have, then they get disappointed. I think diaspora sort of idealism is good, but their actual relationship with Pakistan is not that good, because they keep saying Pakistan should do this, Pakistan, but then you go to Pakistan, live there, and do something for the country. When you're not there, it's easy to sort of criticize and easy to blame. But in one respect, diaspora can play a good part. I think they have at least, wherever they are, trying to sort of raise Pakistan's image. So I would say the diaspora's image is perhaps better than Pakistan's own image, because many of them are quite influential. Many of them are also, for example, in America, they can't compete with the Indian diaspora, which is far more, has a better profile, but Pakistanis are also coming along. And I think if they start playing a good role, that will raise Pakistan's image too. But they have a role. It's just that they're not very realistic. Yeah.
With that, I thank you, Professor Tawqir Hussain, for that rich talk and the candid discussion and answers as well. So please join me in thanking Professor Hussain.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you for all of you thank you to all of you for joining us in this room. It's nice to be back. Thank you.